A father and son's peaceful day at the park takes a shocking turn when a police dog chases the young boy, on orders from a fellow officer. But this father isn't just any bystander. He's a police captain, and now he's determined to hold the officer accountable. What starts as a terrifying moment becomes a powerful battle for justice, shaking the police department and testing the strength of his family. How far will this father go to protect his son and demand the truth? Find out in this gripping story of integrity, courage, and the fight for what's right. Subscribe now to join the journey and let us know in the comments. What would you do in his place? The park was alive with the quiet hum of a Saturday morning. Families spread picnic blankets across the dewy grass, their chatter mixing with the soft rustle of leaves. The sun hung low, casting a golden glow that made the oak trees shimmer in the breeze. Children chased each other along the playground's edges, while joggers weaved through the winding trails. It was a picture-perfect day, the kind that invited people to slow down and savor the moment. For Ethan Marshall, though, this morning was more than just a relaxing start to the weekend. It was one of the rare times he could spend with his son, Lucas. As the captain of the local police force, Ethan's job often kept him away from home, but this morning was theirs. He jogged at a steady pace, keeping a watchful eye on Lucas, who was darting around the park with his favorite toy airplane, its red wings glinting in the sunlight. "Look, Dad! It's flying so high!" Lucas shouted with the enthusiasm only a 6-year-old could muster. He threw the plane into the air, watching it soar for a few moments before it glided back down. Ethan chuckled, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow as he slowed to a walk. "Nice throw, buddy! Just don't run too far." Lucas gave him a quick nod before sprinting toward a hill on the far side of the park. Ethan's heart swelled with pride as he watched his son's tiny legs carry him up the slope, all energy and excitement. Lucas had his mother's spirit, free, curious, and full of joy. Nearby, an older couple strolled by, offering Ethan a warm smile as they passed. He nodded in return, feeling the weight of the badge hidden under his jacket. It wasn't often that he got to blend in like this, to just be Dad and not Captain Marshall. But here, in this park, surrounded by laughter and life, he could let his guard down, just for a little while. As Ethan continued his leisurely pace around the park's perimeter, he noticed a familiar figure walking along one of the trails. Officer Jane Hughes, one of his officers, was patrolling with her police dog, Rocky. The large German shepherd trotted obediently at her side, its sleek coat glistening in the morning light. Ethan waved, and Hughes gave a curt nod in return. Though they worked together, he knew little about her outside of the job. Hughes was a no-nonsense officer, always by the book, but there was a hardness to her that made her difficult to approach. Her expression was as rigid as ever, even here in the peaceful park. Rocky's presence seemed to add to the tension that followed her. The dog was well trained, of course, but its sheer size and alertness had a way of unnerving people. Ethan noticed several park-goers giving the dog a wide berth as they passed, their cheerful conversations faltering as they glanced nervously at the pair. Hughes, however, seemed oblivious to it all. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the park as if she were waiting for something to go wrong. Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. He understood the weight of the job, the constant need to be vigilant. But there was something different about the way she carried herself. Like she couldn't switch off, even in a place as serene as this. Ethan turned his attention back to Lucas, who was now running up and down the hill, his toy airplane clutched tightly in his hand. He laughed as he stumbled through the grass, completely unaware of the world around him. Officer Jane Hughes kept a firm grip on Rocky's leash as she walked the perimeter of the park. The dog moved with precision, his eyes darting to every new sound or movement, his ears perked. She trusted Rocky. He was the epitome of control and discipline, everything she valued in her own life. Unlike the chaotic world around her, Rocky never wavered. But as Hughes walked past the families enjoying their carefree morning, an irritation began to gnaw at her. The laughter of children, the casualness of it all. It grated against her sense of order. She wasn't here to enjoy the day. She was here to ensure that nothing got out of hand. She spotted a young boy running up and down a grassy hill, his laughter carried on the wind. Hughes narrowed her eyes. The boy, around 6 years old, was playing by himself, a toy airplane spinning from his hand as he raced through the grass. He was far from the playground, far from the watchful eyes of his parents. Rocky let out a low growl, sensing her tension. Hughes glanced down at the dog, patting his head briefly before returning her attention to the boy. "What's he doing over there by himself?" she muttered under her breath. The boy's carefree play rubbed her the wrong way. She didn't understand it, this casual disregard for caution. Every fiber of her being was wired to spot trouble, to anticipate the worst. And here was this boy, running wild without a care in the world. It felt wrong. Hughes slowed her pace, watching the boy closely. He stumbled, falling to his knees, but quickly jumped back up, too engrossed in his game to notice the scrape on his skin. He didn't belong here, not without someone keeping a closer eye on him. She glanced around, spotting his father, a man she recognized as Captain Ethan Marshall, on the other side of the park. Hughes's jaw tightened. She had worked under Marshall for years, always maintaining a respectful distance. He was fair, she had to give him that, but his laid-back demeanor had never sat well with her. To her, control was everything, and Marshall seemed too willing to let things slide. It was no wonder his son was running wild, she thought bitterly. Rocky let out another soft growl, drawing her attention back to the boy. The boy's laughter echoed across the park as he chased his toy airplane down the hill. Hughes's hand tightened around Rocky's leash as she watched, her mind racing. Something about the scene didn't sit right with her. The boy was too far from his father, too unrestrained. He was acting suspiciously, wasn't he? Running like that, away from the crowd. It could easily be a sign of trouble. Hughes's heart began to pound. She had been trained to trust her instincts, to act before a situation got out of hand. And her instincts were telling her that this boy needed to be stopped. "Rocky," she murmured, giving the leash a small tug. "Let's go." The dog straightened, his body taut as he awaited her next command. For a moment, Hughes hesitated. She wasn't planning to let Rocky attack, of course. But a chase might be enough to startle the boy, to get him to stop running, to stay put where he belonged. She let out a low whistle, signaling Rocky to move. The dog darted forward, his powerful legs propelling him across the grass. Hughes followed closely behind, her pulse quickening with every step. Rocky's bark rang out, sharp and clear, as he neared the boy. Lucas glanced back, his eyes widening in surprise. For a split second he froze, unsure of what was happening. But as Rocky's barking grew louder, panic set in. He turned and ran faster, his small legs pumping as he tried to outrun the dog. "Stop!" Hughes called out, though it wasn't clear who she was speaking to, Lucas or Rocky. Rocky didn't attack. He simply chased, barking and circling the boy as Lucas ran in desperate zigzags, trying to escape. The dog's bark was terrifying enough, and Lucas's confusion only made things worse. By the time Rocky reached him, Lucas had tripped and fallen again, this time staying on the ground, his body trembling with fear. He looked up at the dog, tears welling in his eyes, but Rocky did nothing more than circle, barking as he waited for Hughes's next command. Lucas lay on the grass, frozen in fear as Rocky circled him, barking furiously. The dog hadn't hurt him, but the noise and speed of the chase had sent Lucas into a state of shock. His toy airplane lay forgotten beside him as he tried to catch his breath. "Daddy!" he cried, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his cheeks. "Daddy, help!" Ethan's heart lurched at the sound of his son's voice. He had been chatting with another father, but the second Lucas's cry pierced the air, he knew something was wrong. He spun around, his eyes scanning the park until he spotted the source of the commotion. Lucas, lying on the ground. Rocky circling him. "Lucas!" Ethan shouted, sprinting across the park, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. His heart pounded in his chest as fear and anger surged through him. In the distance, he saw Hughes standing frozen, watching as her dog continued to bark at his son. She wasn't moving to stop it. Ethan's mind raced, torn between calming his son and confronting Hughes. He could feel the eyes of the park on him, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. But his first priority was Lucas. He reached his son in a matter of seconds, dropping to his knees beside him. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, pulling Lucas into his arms. "I'm here. You're safe." Lucas clung to him, his small body shaking with sobs. Ethan's heart broke as he held his son close, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He kept his voice calm for Lucas's sake, but his eyes were locked on Hughes. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. Hughes hesitated, the leash still clenched tightly in her hand. "He was acting suspiciously," she began, but Ethan cut her off. "He's 6 years old." Ethan's voice rose slightly, though he kept his tone controlled. "You sent a police dog to chase a child." The park was no longer peaceful. What had been a place of joy and laughter was now filled with the sharp barks of a police dog and the rising murmur of bystanders. Ethan held Lucas tightly, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The cool breeze did nothing to calm the heat that was building inside him. Lucas's small body trembled against Ethan's chest, the boy's face buried in his father's shirt, sobbing quietly. His scraped knees were visible, but the physical pain was the least of Ethan's concerns. The fear that radiated from his son was palpable, and it tore at Ethan's heart. He could feel eyes on him from all directions. A crowd was beginning to gather, people whispering, some recording the scene on their phones. The sight of Rocky, the police dog still pacing in place, only fueled the intensity of the moment. The parkgoers were confused, unsure of why a child had been chased by a police dog, and the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. Ethan looked up at Officer Jane Hughes, his eyes narrowing with controlled fury. She was standing a few feet away, her face pale, her hand still gripping Rocky's leash. Her body was stiff, as if she were trying to maintain her composure, but the slight tremble in her hand betrayed her uncertainty. "Hughes," Ethan called out, his voice calm but firm, "get your dog out of here." Hughes blinked, seemingly shaken from her daze. She gave a sharp tug on Rocky's leash, and the dog obediently returned to her side, no longer barking, but still alert. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the soft sobs of Lucas clinging to his father. "What were you thinking?" Ethan demanded again, rising to his feet, though his tone remained controlled for Lucas's sake. He didn't want to lose his temper in front of his son. "He's just a kid." Hughes stiffened, her professional instincts kicking in. "He was running," she said, her voice firm but lacking the usual confidence. "He was far from the playground. It looked like—" "It looked like what?" Ethan interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "You thought a 6-year-old playing with a toy airplane was a threat?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with disbelief. Hughes shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny, but she refused to back down. "I was following protocol," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "He was acting out of the ordinary. It's my job to ensure the safety of the park." Ethan's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, to tell her how wrong she was, but the eyes of the crowd and the quiet sobs of his son kept him grounded. He could feel the judgment from the onlookers, both toward Hughes and toward himself, and he knew that whatever he said next had to be measured. Lucas sniffed, looking up at his father with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I was just playing." Ethan's heart broke. He knelt down, brushing a stray tear from Lucas's cheek. "I know, buddy. I know. It's not your fault." As Ethan cradled his son, a wave of anger surged through him, hotter and fiercer than before. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was about Lucas's safety, his innocence, and the way Hughes had made him feel like a criminal for simply being a child. But Ethan knew he couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. Not now. Not here. The crowd continued to grow, and some of the bystanders began murmuring loudly enough for Ethan to hear. "Why'd she send the dog after him?" one woman asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "He's just a little boy." Ethan stood again, his hands gently resting on Lucas's shoulders. He turned to face Hughes, who was still holding the leash, her posture rigid as she tried to maintain control of the situation. "Look around," Ethan said, his voice steady but sharp. Do you see the panic you've caused? Do you hear what people are saying? This didn't need to happen." Hughes flinched at his words, though she kept her expression neutral. "I did what I thought was necessary to maintain order," she insisted, her voice growing firmer. "The dog wasn't going to hurt him." "He wasn't going to hurt him?" Ethan repeated incredulously. "He chased him, barking like he was some kind of criminal. Do you have any idea what that does to a 6-year-old? You terrified him." Lucas tugged on Ethan's pant leg, his voice still small. "I was scared, Daddy." Ethan's anger flared again, but this time he directed it inward. He should have been watching more closely. He should have been there to stop this before it spiraled out of control. The guilt gnawed at him, though he knew it wasn't really his fault. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm for Lucas's sake. He wasn't just a father in this moment. He was also a captain, and he needed to act with the same level-headedness he expected from his officers. "Lucas," Ethan said softly, crouching down to his son's level, "why don't you go sit on that bench over there for a minute, okay? I need to talk to Officer Hughes." Lucas hesitated, but after a reassuring nod from Ethan, he shuffled over to the bench, clutching his toy airplane tightly in his hands. He sat down, his eyes never leaving his father. Once Lucas was safely out of earshot, Ethan turned back to Hughes, his expression hard. "You and I both know this was a serious misjudgment," he said, keeping his voice low but firm. "You need to understand the impact of what just happened. That's my son. You chased a 6-year-old like he was a threat. Do you realize what that's going to do to him? To me?" Hughes's face remained stony, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I was following protocol," she repeated, though the words lacked the conviction they had before. "Protocol isn't an excuse for poor judgment," Ethan snapped. "You need to report this, and you need to be ready for the consequences." For a moment, Hughes stood frozen, uncertainty clouding her features. But then she squared her shoulders and nodded stiffly. "I'll file a report." Ethan shook his head. "Not just a report. This goes higher. This isn't going to be swept under the rug." The events at the park were quickly recorded by several onlookers, and within hours, the video footage of the incident was making the rounds on social media. The narrative, like most things on the internet, spun out of control almost instantly. Posts with titles like "Police Dog Chases Child in Local Park" and "Officer Overreacts in Incident Involving 6-Year-Old" were shared thousands of times. The public was quick to react, and outrage spread like wildfire. People were furious, not only with Officer Hughes, but with the system that allowed such an incident to occur. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from concerned friends, others from colleagues who were trying to understand what had happened. The pressure to respond, to address the growing controversy, weighed heavily on his shoulders. But all he wanted to do was focus on Lucas. At home, the Marshall household was a stark contrast to the peaceful Saturday morning they had left behind. Emma, Ethan's wife, sat at the kitchen table, her face drawn with worry as she scrolled through the latest social media updates. "This is getting out of hand," she said quietly, her fingers tightening around her phone. "People are calling for her resignation." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, exhaustion creeping into his bones. "They're right to be angry," he said, though his voice was tired. "But this is bigger than just Hughes. This is about how we do things, how we respond to situations like this." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with concern. "And how are you going to respond?" Ethan paused, glancing toward the living room where Lucas sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over him. The boy was quiet, too quiet for his usual energetic self. He hadn't said much since they got home from the park, and it broke Ethan's heart to see him like this. "I have to report it," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "I have to hold her accountable." As the outrage grew, so did the media's interest in the story. News outlets picked up the video, replaying the moment Rocky chased Lucas in slow motion over and over again. The headlines were stark: "Police misconduct or misjudgment. A family caught in the crossfire." The Marshall family found themselves at the center of a media storm they hadn't asked for. Reporters showed up at their house, cameras flashing as they tried to get a statement from Ethan or Emma. Neighbors gossiped about the incident, and even at school, Lucas was bombarded with questions from classmates who had seen the video online. Lucas's behavior began to change. He no longer wanted to go outside to play, instead spending most of his time indoors, glued to the TV or sitting quietly with his toys. The joy that usually radiated from him had dimmed, and both Ethan and Emma were at a loss for how to help him. One evening, after the house had fallen quiet, Emma approached Ethan as he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We need to do something," she said softly. "Lucas isn't himself anymore." Ethan sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "I know," he whispered, "but I don't know what to do. I thought standing up for him, for what's right, would make things better. But now it feels like it's only making things worse." Emma placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're doing the right thing, Ethan. But maybe we need to focus on Lucas for a while. Let the investigation play out, but don't let it consume us." Ethan nodded, though the weight of his decision still hung heavy in the air. He had filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs, and the investigation into Hughes's actions was already underway. But he knew this was only the beginning of what would be a long and difficult journey. The next morning, Ethan sat in his office at the police precinct, staring at the paperwork spread across his desk. The formal complaint against Hughes had been submitted, and the wheels of Internal Affairs were in motion. But the process would take time, and in the meantime, Ethan had to deal with the fallout. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Detective Mike Walker, one of his closest colleagues. Ethan answered, leaning back in his chair. "Ethan," Walker said, his voice serious, "I heard about the complaint. Hughes isn't going to take this lying down." Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I don't expect her to, but what she did, it wasn't right, Mike. I can't let it slide." Walker was silent for a moment before replying. "You're right, of course, but you need to be ready for the backlash. Hughes has been with the department for years. She's got allies." "I'm aware," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But this isn't about politics. It's about accountability. Just watch your back," Walker warned. "People are talking, and not all of them are on your side." Ethan hung up the phone, feeling the pressure mount. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't back down now. Not for Lucas. Not for the other families who had been affected by similar situations. The battle was just beginning. The day of the Internal Affairs hearing arrived faster than Ethan had anticipated. He had spent the past week preparing, gathering witness statements, reviewing the events over and over in his mind, and balancing his responsibilities at home with the increasing tension at work. The weight of it all was exhausting, and he felt it every time he looked into his son's eyes. Lucas hadn't been the same since the incident. The once vibrant, energetic boy now spent his days quiet and withdrawn, refusing to play outside or even talk about what had happened. The memory of Rocky chasing him through the park had left a mark, one that couldn't be erased easily. For Ethan, seeing his son's joy diminish was perhaps the hardest part of it all. Sitting in the small conference room where the hearing was taking place, Ethan felt the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. Across from him, Officer Jane Hughes sat stiffly, her uniform perfectly pressed, her posture rigid. She was accompanied by a union representative and her lawyer, a man named Gerald Marks, whose sharp features and slicked-back hair gave him an air of smug confidence. Ethan's own lawyer, Naomi Clark, sat beside him. Naomi was sharp, no nonsense, and had a reputation for taking on cases like this with a cool-headed determination. Ethan had been grateful for her guidance through the process, though he wished the situation had never escalated to this point. The panel of senior officers from Internal Affairs sat at the head of the table, their faces unreadable as they shuffled through papers and prepared for the proceedings to begin. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken judgments and anticipation. The lead investigator, Sergeant Wallace, a tall, stern man with years of experience, cleared his throat and glanced at Ethan and Hughes in turn. "Captain Marshall, Officer Hughes," he began, his voice measured and formal. "We're here today to review the events that took place at the park involving Officer Hughes and your son, Lucas Marshall." We will hear statements from both parties and review the evidence to determine if any misconduct occurred. Ethan nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want to appear too emotional or too detached. He had to strike the right balance. Hughes, on the other hand, remained expressionless, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had the look of someone who was prepared for battle. Sergeant Wallace continued, "Officer Hughes, we'll start with you. Please explain your actions on that day." Hughes sat up straighter, her lawyer giving her a slight nod. She took a deep breath and began. "On the morning of the incident," she said, her voice steady but mechanical, "I was on routine patrol with my K-9 unit, Rocky. I observed a young boy, Lucas, running by himself at the far end of the park, away from the playground. His behavior seemed unusual, as he was separated from other children and adults. As part of my duty to ensure safety in the park, I directed Rocky to approach the boy to prevent him from running further and to assess the situation. The boy looked so scared. I remember thinking, why is a police dog chasing a child? It just didn't seem right." Other witnesses echoed similar sentiments, describing the confusion and fear that spread through the park that morning. But not everyone was on Ethan's side. Some of Hughes's colleagues spoke in her defense, arguing that she was simply doing her job and following protocol. Detective Mike Rogers, a senior officer, testified that Hughes had always been a reliable and disciplined officer, and that her decision-making had never been called into question before this incident. "Jane's a good cop," Rogers said firmly. "She's been with us for years. I don't think she meant for any of this to happen, and I believe she was acting in good faith." The room was divided, with some officers supporting Ethan's call for accountability, while others were more concerned with protecting one of their own. Ethan could feel the tension mounting. The divide between those who wanted justice for Lucas and those who saw this as a threat to the department's cohesion. By the end of the day, the air in the conference room was thick with tension. Ethan sat in silence, his hands clenched in his lap, as the panel retreated to deliberate. He knew that this decision would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Hughes, but for his career and for Lucas's future. Naomi leaned over, her voice low. "You did well, Ethan. No matter what happens, you made your case clear. It's up to them now." Ethan nodded, but the pit in his stomach remained. He glanced at Hughes, who sat across the room with her lawyer. She looked composed, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or fear of what might come next. The panel returned after what felt like an eternity. Sergeant Wallace cleared his throat, his expression grave. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimonies from both parties, Wallace began, "We have concluded that Officer Hughes's actions, while not intentionally harmful, did not follow proper judgment in handling the situation involving Lucas Marshall. As a result, Officer Hughes will be suspended pending further review." The decision hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Hughes's face remained expressionless, but Ethan could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. She had been spared immediate termination, but the suspension was a blow nonetheless. Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. The decision was a step toward accountability, but it didn't feel like a victory. Lucas was still struggling, and the damage done to his sense of safety couldn't be undone by a suspension alone. As the hearing concluded, Ethan stood up, his body tense with exhaustion. Hughes avoided his gaze as she left the room with her lawyer, but Ethan didn't care. He wasn't here for her, he was here for Lucas. As Ethan walked out of the precinct, the cool evening air hit him like a wave of relief. He paused outside the building, taking a deep breath and closing his eyes for a moment, trying to let the tension of the day slip away. But even as the hearing ended, the battle wasn't over. There would be more scrutiny, more questions, and more pressure to either close ranks or push for further accountability. And at the heart of it all was Lucas, his little boy who had been caught in the middle of something far bigger than he could understand. Emma had been right. Lucas needed him more than ever now. The investigation had done its part, but it was time to focus on healing, on helping Lucas find his way back to the carefree joy he had lost. When Ethan arrived home, Lucas was sitting on the couch, a book in his lap, but his eyes unfocused, staring out the window. Emma was in the kitchen, the smell of dinner filling the house. Ethan sat down beside his son, placing a gentle hand on Lucas's back. "How are you feeling, buddy?" he asked softly. Lucas shrugged, not looking up from the book. "Okay, I guess." Ethan's heart ached at the quiet, subdued tone in his son's voice. "I'm here," he said, wrapping an arm around Lucas. "Whatever you need, I'm always here." Ethan sat in his office the morning after the hearing, staring out the window, lost in thought. He had hoped that Officer Hughes's suspension would bring some measure of peace, some sense of closure to what had happened, but it hadn't. Instead, it felt like a pause, a brief reprieve before the next storm. The department was buzzing with whispers. He could feel it every time he walked through the hallways, the tension, the unspoken judgments, the subtle change in how some of his fellow officers looked at him. Ethan knew that going up against a colleague, even for the right reasons, had made him a target. It was an unwritten rule in the police force. You don't turn on your own. But Ethan couldn't stay silent, not after what happened to Lucas. A soft knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and Detective Mike Walker stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Walker had been one of Ethan's closest colleagues for years, a reliable detective with a level-headed approach. But even now, Ethan couldn't help but wonder where Walker stood in all of this. "Got a minute?" Walker asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Of course," Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair. He motioned to the chair across from his desk, and Walker sat down, folding his arms. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan could sense that Walker had something important to say, but he was holding back. Finally, Walker broke the silence. "You're making waves, Ethan." Ethan sighed. He had expected this conversation sooner or later. "I'm not trying to make waves, Mike. I'm just trying to hold people accountable. Hughes made a serious mistake, and it's my job to address it." Walker nodded slowly, but his expression remained guarded. "I get that. But you've been here long enough to know that things aren't always so black and white. The department? Well, some folks don't like seeing one of our own getting put under the microscope like this." Ethan felt his frustration simmering beneath the surface. He respected Walker, but this wasn't just about loyalty to the department. It was about doing what was right. "I didn't come to this decision lightly," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But Hughes sent a police dog after my son, Mike, a 6-year-old boy. That's not something I can just overlook." Walker exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. And believe me, I understand why you're doing this. But you need to be prepared for what's coming next. There are people higher up who aren't happy about this investigation. Hughes has friends in high places, and they're not going to let her go down without a fight." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I'm not backing down." Walker met his gaze, his eyes serious. "Just watch your back, Ethan. The more you push, the more resistance you're going to face. And it might not just be from the department." Back at home, the atmosphere was just as tense, though for different reasons. Ethan's wife, Emma, had been quietly supportive throughout the investigation. But Ethan could tell that the strain was beginning to take its toll on her. She had always been the steady one, the person who kept the family grounded no matter what was happening in the outside world. But now, even Emma seemed worn down by the weight of it all. Lucas was the hardest part. The boy was still withdrawn, still unwilling to go outside or play the way he used to. Ethan had tried everything, talking to him, taking him for walks, encouraging him to return to his favorite activities, but nothing seemed to work. Lucas was stuck in a state of fear, and Ethan didn't know how to pull him out of it. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Ethan noticed Lucas pushing his food around on his plate without eating. His brow furrowed in concern. "Lucas, buddy," Ethan said softly, "you've barely touched your dinner. You feeling okay?" Lucas shrugged, not meeting his father's eyes. "I'm not hungry." Ethan exchanged a glance with Emma, who gave him a small, worried nod. "Lucas," Ethan continued, his voice gentle but firm, "I know you've been feeling scared since what happened at the park. But you're safe now. Rocky's not going to hurt you. I promise." Lucas looked up, his eyes wide and uncertain. "But what if it happens again, Daddy?" What if another dog chases me? Ethan's heart clenched at the fear in his son's voice. He wished he could offer a perfect solution, some magic words to make it all go away, but he knew that wasn't how trauma worked. "We're going to make sure that doesn't happen," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And you know I'm always here to protect you, right?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah." Ethan reached across the table and ruffled Lucas's hair, offering a small smile. "We're going to get through this, buddy. I promise." After dinner, once Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan and Emma sat together on the couch in the living room. The silence between them was comfortable but heavy, filled with the unspoken worries that had lingered ever since the incident. Emma rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, her fingers tracing small circles on his arm. "He's still scared," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I know. I just want him to be okay again," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "I miss our happy little boy." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared grief hanging in the air. Ethan knew that the road to healing would be long, both for Lucas and for their family. But he wasn't going to give up. Not on Lucas, not on justice, and not on making things right. A few days later, as the department's investigation into Hughes continued, Ethan received an unexpected call from an old colleague, Marcus Fletcher. Marcus had left the force a few years ago after a dispute with Hughes and had since gone on to work in private security. Ethan hadn't spoken to him in years, but the call had piqued his curiosity. "Ethan, I heard about what's going on with Hughes," Marcus said over the phone. "I think I can help." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I've got some information," Marcus said carefully. "Stuff that I didn't have a chance to bring up when I was on the force. Hughes isn't as clean as she wants everyone to think. There were incidents, reports that were buried, complaints that never saw the light of day. I've got the records." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. If what Marcus was saying was true, it could be the key to pushing the investigation forward and ensuring that Hughes was held accountable. "I need to see those records," Ethan said. "This could change everything." Marcus hesitated. "I'll meet you tonight, but you didn't hear any of this from me, okay?" That evening, Ethan met Marcus in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The place was dimly lit, with only a few other patrons scattered across the room. Marcus was already seated in a corner booth when Ethan arrived, a folder lying on the table in front of him. Ethan slid into the seat across from him, his eyes immediately drawn to the folder. "Is that it?" he asked. Marcus nodded, sliding the folder across the table. "Everything's in there. Emails, internal reports, complaints from officers and civilians alike. Hughes has a history of overstepping her bounds, but the department kept it quiet. They didn't want the bad press." Ethan opened the folder and began flipping through the documents. His pulse quickened as he read the records. Complaints of excessive force, reports of inappropriate conduct, all swept under the rug by higher-ups in the department. It was a damning pattern, and it painted a very different picture of Hughes than the one she had presented at the hearing. "This is exactly what I need," Ethan said, his voice filled with determination. "This will prove that what happened with Lucas wasn't an isolated incident." Marcus leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Just be careful, Ethan. You're going up against some powerful people. They're not going to like you digging this stuff up." Ethan nodded, but the warning didn't deter him. He had come too far to turn back now. With this new evidence, he could push for a full investigation into Hughes's conduct. And maybe, just maybe, he could get the justice that Lucas deserved. The next day, armed with the new evidence, Ethan went to see Sergeant Wallace, the head of the Internal Affairs investigation. Wallace was a no-nonsense leader, someone who valued integrity. But Ethan knew that even he would be under pressure from the higher-ups to keep the department's reputation intact. Ethan sat across from Wallace in his office, the folder of evidence sitting on the desk between them. "Sergeant, you need to see this," Ethan said, pushing the folder forward. "These are records that were buried, complaints against Officer Hughes that were never properly addressed. This isn't just about what happened with Lucas. It's about a pattern of misconduct." Wallace flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing as he read. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though his tone wasn't accusatory, more curious than anything else. "I can't reveal my source," Ethan said. "But the evidence is solid. This is bigger than one incident in the park. Hughes has been out of line before, and the department looked the other way." Wallace sighed, leaning back in his chair. "This changes things," he admitted. "We'll have to expand the investigation." Ethan felt a surge of relief. For the first time since the incident, it felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. Word of the expanded investigation into Officer Hughes spread through the department like wildfire. Ethan could feel the shift in atmosphere the moment he stepped into the precinct the next morning. Conversations stopped abruptly as he walked by, and officers who had once greeted him with respect now gave him cold, wary looks. He tried to focus on his work, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. The investigation had placed a spotlight on the department's internal issues, and many officers saw Ethan as the source of that scrutiny. It didn't matter that Hughes had a history of misconduct. What mattered to them was that Ethan had broken the unwritten code by going after one of their own. It wasn't long before Detective Mike Walker stopped by Ethan's office, his expression grim. "You've really stirred up a hornet's nest," Walker said, closing the door behind him. "People are talking, Ethan. A lot of them think you're trying to take down the whole department." Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I'm not trying to take anyone down, Mike. I just want justice for Lucas. This is about holding Hughes accountable for what she did." Walker sighed, leaning against the door. "I know that. But not everyone sees it that way. You're challenging the system, and the system doesn't like being challenged." Ethan looked up at Walker, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I'm not going to back down. Not now." "I didn't expect you to," Walker replied, crossing his arms. "But you need to be ready for what's coming next. The higher-ups are going to push back. They don't want this investigation going public." Ethan's jaw tightened. This isn't just about Lucas anymore. There are other families, other people who've been affected by Hughes's actions. If the department tries to cover this up, they'll have a lot more than just one angry father on their hands. Walker gave him a long, measured look before nodding. "Just watch your step. The people you're going up against, they play dirty. At home, things weren't much easier." The investigation was taking its toll on Ethan and his family, and the strain was starting to show. Lucas was still struggling with the aftermath of the incident, his anxiety manifesting in small but painful ways. He was quieter than usual, hesitant to go outside or play with other kids, and his sleep was often interrupted by nightmares. One night, after another restless evening with Lucas waking up in tears, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Emma joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "He's still having nightmares, Ethan," Emma said softly, her voice filled with worry. "I don't know how to help him anymore." Ethan sighed, lifting his head to meet her gaze. "I don't either," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought that by fighting for justice, by holding Hughes accountable, it would make things better. But it feels like it's only making things worse." Emma squeezed his shoulder, her expression gentle. "You're doing the right thing. Lucas knows that you're fighting for him. But maybe we need to focus on helping him heal. The investigation is important, but so is our family." Ethan nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. He had thrown himself into the fight for justice, but in the process, he had neglected the emotional toll it was taking on his family, especially Lucas. "I'll make more time for him," Ethan promised. "I'll be here more. I won't let this investigation take over everything." Emma gave him a small, encouraging smile. "We'll get through this. Together." A few days later, Ethan received a call from Sergeant Wallace, requesting a private meeting. The expanded investigation was moving forward, and Wallace wanted to discuss the next steps. Ethan knew that this meeting would be crucial, not just for the investigation, but for the future of his career. When Ethan arrived at Wallace's office, the sergeant was already seated behind his desk, a thick file of documents in front of him. "Take a seat, Captain," Wallace said, motioning to the chair across from him. Ethan sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced tough situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about his job. It was about justice, accountability, and the future of his family. Wallace leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "We've reviewed the new evidence you provided," he said, his tone serious. "The complaints against Hughes are damning. If this goes public, it's going to cause a major backlash for the department." Ethan nodded, already knowing what was coming next. "And what do you want to do about it?" Wallace hesitated for a moment before answering. "The department's top brass wants to handle this quietly. They're willing to take disciplinary action against Hughes, but they don't want the media involved. They're offering you a deal. If you agree to keep this internal, they'll expedite the investigation and ensure that Hughes is removed from the force." Ethan felt a surge of anger rise within him. "You want me to stay quiet so the department can save face?" Wallace's expression remained neutral. "It's not about saving face, Ethan. It's about keeping the peace. If this blows up in the media, it's going to damage the entire department's reputation. We're trying to find a solution that holds Hughes accountable without dragging everyone else down with her." Ethan's mind raced. On one hand, the offer meant that Hughes would face consequences for her actions, and it would spare his family from further media attention. On the other hand, it felt like a cover-up, a way for the department to sweep years of misconduct under the rug without addressing the larger issues. "I'm not looking for revenge," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "But I won't let this be buried either. There are people who deserve to know the truth." Wallace leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Think carefully about this, Ethan. If you take this public, you're going to make a lot of enemies. And it won't just affect you, it'll affect your family." Ethan stood up, his decision already made. "I'll do what's right. If that makes me enemies, so be it." After the meeting with Wallace, Ethan returned home, his mind racing with the implications of the department's offer. He couldn't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, he wanted to protect his family from the fallout of a public scandal. But on the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that accepting the deal would mean letting the department continue to cover up its problems. That evening, Ethan sat with Emma, explaining everything that had happened in the meeting. "They want to keep it quiet," Ethan said, running a hand through his hair. "They're offering to take action against Hughes, but only if I agree to keep this internal." Emma frowned, her brow furrowed in concern. "And what happens if you don't agree?" "They're worried about the media. If I push for this to go public, it's going to create a lot of backlash. Not just for Hughes, but for the entire department." Emma sat quietly for a moment, processing the information. "Do you think they'll really hold Hughes accountable if you take the deal?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. They're offering to remove her, but I have a feeling they'll just sweep the rest under the rug." Emma placed a hand on his arm, her voice gentle. "You need to do what's right, Ethan. For Lucas, for yourself, and for everyone else who's been hurt by this. If that means going public, then we'll face whatever comes." Ethan looked into her eyes, feeling a surge of gratitude for her unwavering support. He knew the decision wasn't easy, but it was clear to him now what needed to be done. "I won't stay quiet," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Hughes needs to be held accountable, and the truth needs to come out." The next morning, Ethan made the decision to take the investigation public. He contacted Naomi Clark, his lawyer, and they began preparing a public statement. Ethan knew the risks involved, but he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. The following week, Ethan held a press conference, standing in front of reporters and cameras with Naomi by his side. He spoke clearly and confidently, outlining the findings of the investigation and the years of misconduct that had been covered up within the department. "This isn't just about my son," Ethan said, his voice strong. "It's about a system that failed to hold one of its own accountable. Officer Hughes made serious mistakes, and those mistakes were ignored for years. I'm here today to make sure that doesn't happen again." The press conference sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the entire community was talking about the investigation. Public support for Ethan grew, with many rallying behind his call for transparency and accountability. But the backlash from within the department was swift. Ethan received cold stares and whispered comments from some of his colleagues, while others outright avoided him. He knew that his decision to go public had cost him the trust of many within the force, but he didn't regret it. The truth needed to be told. A few days after the press conference, Ethan received a call from Sergeant Wallace. The department had concluded its investigation, and Officer Hughes had been officially removed from the force. It wasn't the sweeping reform Ethan had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. When he told Lucas about the news, his son looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Does this mean she can't hurt anyone else?" Lucas asked quietly. Ethan smiled, kneeling down to meet Lucas's gaze. "That's right, buddy. She's not going to hurt anyone else." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan saw a spark of joy in his son's eyes. It wasn't a complete return to normal, but it was a start. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Ethan took Lucas for a walk in the park. The same park where everything had started. Lucas held his father's hand tightly, but this time, there was no fear in his eyes, only the quiet peace of a boy who knew his father had fought for him. The aftermath of Ethan's decision to take the investigation public rippled through the police department and the city in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The news of Officer Hughes being removed from the force was met with mixed reactions. Some praised Ethan for his courage and his commitment to seeking justice, while others accused him of turning his back on his colleagues. The media attention, though initially overwhelming, began to die down as the story evolved into something larger, something that transcended the incident with Hughes. The city council announced plans to review police procedures, particularly those involving K-9 units, and a wave of conversations about accountability and reform began to sweep through the community. Ethan watched these developments with a sense of cautious optimism. His actions had sparked change, even if it wasn't the sweeping reform he had initially hoped for. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had done something to prevent future incidents like the one that had traumatized his son. At home, things were slowly improving. Lucas was beginning to heal, though the process was gradual. His fear had lessened, and he had even started playing outside again, though always with a watchful eye on his surroundings. The nightmares hadn't disappeared completely, but they were less frequent, and his laughter was beginning to return. Soft at first, but more genuine with each passing day. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Lucas looked up at his father with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, does this mean the bad people are gone now?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent wonder. Ethan exchanged a glance with Emma, his heart aching at the simplicity of the question. He knelt down in front of Lucas, resting a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Not all of them, buddy," Ethan said softly, "but we're trying to make things better. And I'm always going to do everything I can to protect you. You know that, right?" Lucas nodded, his small hand gripping Ethan's tightly. "I know, Daddy." As the weeks went by, the tension that had once filled the Marshall household began to lift. Ethan made a concerted effort to spend more time with Lucas, taking him to the park on weekends, playing games with him, and simply being present. He knew that his son needed him more than ever, and he was determined not to let the pressures of the investigation pull him away from his family again. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan and Lucas returned to the park where the incident had occurred. The decision to return hadn't been an easy one. Lucas had been hesitant at first, and Ethan had worried about whether his son was truly ready. But Lucas had insisted, his determination surprising both his parents. As they walked along the familiar path, Ethan felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He watched Lucas carefully, looking for any signs of fear or discomfort. But to his surprise, Lucas seemed calm, his small hand holding tightly onto his father's. "Daddy, can I go play?" Lucas asked, glancing toward the playground where other children were laughing and running around. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, buddy. I'll be right here." Lucas ran off toward the playground, and Ethan watched as his son joined a group of kids playing tag. There was a lightness in Lucas's step that Ethan hadn't seen in months, and for the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Emma arrived shortly after, walking up beside Ethan and slipping her hand into his. "He looks happy," she said, her voice filled with quiet relief. Ethan nodded, his gaze still fixed on Lucas. "He does. It feels like we're finally getting back to normal." Emma smiled, resting her head against Ethan's shoulder. "I knew we would. It just took time." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close as they watched their son play. There was still healing to be done, but they were moving forward, together. A few days later, Ethan was called into Chief Wallace's office for a final debrief on the investigation. The meeting was brief and formal, with Wallace outlining the department's next steps in light of Officer Hughes's removal. Reforms would be made, changes to protocols would be implemented, and the department's relationship with the community would be a top priority moving forward. As the meeting ended, Wallace looked up at Ethan with an expression that was difficult to read. "You did the right thing, Captain," Wallace said, his tone measured. "Even if not everyone in this department agrees, you set a standard for accountability that we need to uphold." Ethan nodded, grateful for the chief's support. "I appreciate that, sir. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one." Wallace leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "The department is going to be under a lot of scrutiny in the coming months. We're going to need officers like you to lead the way." Ethan met Wallace's gaze, feeling the weight of the responsibility that came with those words. He had fought hard for justice, not just for Lucas, but for the entire community. And now, as the dust began to settle, he realized that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. "I'll do my part," Ethan said firmly, "for my family and for the people we're supposed to protect." Wallace gave a curt nod, his expression softening slightly. "Good, because we've got a lot of work to do." As time passed, the media attention surrounding the investigation began to fade. The community, however, continued to feel the effects of the changes Ethan had set in motion. Police reforms were introduced, and a renewed focus on accountability became a central part of the department's mission. For Ethan, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. The scars of the incident remained, but they were healing. Lucas was becoming more confident, more like his old self, and Ethan could see the spark of joy returning to his son's eyes. It wasn't a perfect recovery, but it was progress. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Ethan and Emma took Lucas for a walk through the neighborhood. The air was warm, and the sound of children playing echoed from nearby yards. It was a peaceful moment, one that reminded Ethan of how far they had come. As they walked, Lucas skipped ahead, turning back to smile at his parents. "Come on, slowpokes," he called, his voice full of playful energy. Ethan chuckled, exchanging a smile with Emma. "We better catch up," he said, picking up the pace. They followed Lucas down the path, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the road. As they walked, Ethan felt a sense of closure, a feeling that the worst was finally behind them. The journey had been long and painful, but they had come through it stronger, together. Ethan knew that there would always be challenges ahead. The fight for justice was never truly over, and the scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight. But for now, in this quiet moment with his family, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The park, which had once been the site of so much fear and uncertainty, had now become a place of renewal. Lucas ran across the grass, his laughter echoing in the warm afternoon air. Ethan and Emma watched from a nearby bench, their hands intertwined, as their son played with the same carefree abandon he had before the incident. It had taken time, more time than Ethan had expected, but Lucas was healing. The nightmares were less frequent. The fear that had gripped him had loosened its hold, and the boy's bright spirit had returned. Ethan leaned back on the bench, watching Lucas with a smile. "I didn't think we'd ever get here," he said quietly. Emma squeezed his hand. "We did, because you fought for him, and you never gave up." Ethan nodded, his heart full. "I fought for all of us." As they sat there, watching their son run freely in the park, Ethan realized that the fight for justice had changed him too. He had learned that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, that sometimes it meant standing alone, facing criticism, and risking everything for the truth. But he had also learned that the fight was worth it. For Lucas, for his family, and for every person who deserved to live in a world where justice was more than just a word. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues across the park, Ethan stood up, offering his hand to Emma. "Come on," he said with a smile. "Let's go catch up with him." Together, they walked toward their son, ready to embrace whatever challenges the future might bring. For now, though, they were at peace, knowing that they had stood up for what was right and had come out stronger on the other side. As the family walked off into the sunset, embracing the peace they had fought so hard to find, Ethan knew that their journey, though challenging, had made them stronger. It was a reminder that doing what's right always matters, even when the road is tough. And just like Ethan's fight for justice, we all face our own battles every day. If you've been moved by this story and want to see more stories of resilience, justice, and courage, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us on this journey of storytelling, where every fight for what's right brings hope and change. Don't miss out on the next powerful story. We've got so much more coming your way. Subscribe now and be a part of a community that believes in the power of standing up for what's right.